Okay, so I think we're gonna get started here. Just to start things off, each city will need to call their meeting to order, so we'll run through them individually, and then we can do a joint pledge of allegiance for the cities who do a pledge of allegiance before their meetings. So I know Goodhue is not holding an official meeting, so Mazeppa, if you want to call your meeting to order.
Yep, call meeting to order.
Pine Island.
Call meeting to order.
Wanamingo. And Zumbrota.
Call the meeting to order.
Okay, if everyone wants to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, that went a little bit smoother than what we thought it was going to, so thank you for that. So I'll first start off by introducing myself. My name is Elizabeth Howard. I'm the city administrator in Pine Island. We will start a slideshow here that everyone has put a lot of time and effort into. I'll kind of run through a short agenda first, and then we'll go through some housekeeping rules about some instructions for tonight's meeting. You can go to the next slide, Courtney. So we called to order. Then Pine Island will go through the welcome instructions. Zumbrota and Goodhue will go through the history and kind of describe how we got here tonight and how we brought all these cities together. Then we'll have a short presentation from the MPCA explaining what a sanitary district is, since this might be a little bit of a foreign concept to some of us. Each engineer from each city, or no, the engineers will go through the pros and cons of a district. So they've split that up and they'll try to break that down for you. Then each engineer will go through their own community's background, just so we can talk about the individual communities and the individual needs of those communities. Then we'll discuss the funding discussion, which I know is probably what most people want to start talking about, and listening to the different funding options. And then Brian Grudem and myself will talk about the next steps and somewhat timeline that we've put together to kind of see what's next and where we headed in the future. You can go to the next slide. So first off, I want to say welcome. Again, thank you for taking your time to come to this meeting tonight. Again, staff and engineers and multiple different agencies have come together to work on this. So we thank you for taking time out of your night to come. First, I want to remind you that this is an open meeting for most of the cities involved, and the meeting is being recorded. So just be aware of that as we proceed tonight. We are recording this and it will be available to the cities. We'll try to get that to you tomorrow so you can post it as needed. I'll go through some rules and the format of the virtual meeting. I do ask that everyone mute yourself unless you're speaking. I think we've all been in a Zoom meeting where you wish someone was muted, so please don't be that person. Also, we will be using the chat feature for questions. So if a question does arise, we ask that someone just puts that into the chat. We can see the chat here on our screen, so then we can read those. We'll kind of determine whether the question needs to be asked at that time, or if I think the question might be answered on a later slide, I might forego that question and not ask it if I feel that it will be answered later. This is just to help keep the meeting moving forward. If the answer or the question is not addressed, then we can definitely ask it again at the end of the meeting. Another point I would like to make is that if you have a question that pertains somewhat to your own city and not the sanitary district idea as a whole, I ask that maybe you reserve that question for your administrator or your public works director or your engineer at maybe a meeting within your city. That again will just help keep the meeting moving forward tonight, rather than take the individual city questions during this entire meeting here. And then lastly, I just ask speakers, when you are presenting your slides, please introduce yourself at the beginning. And for anyone else who would like information on a speaker or has a specific question after tonight for a speaker, just get in touch with one of your city staff and we'll be sure to get you their contact information, or we can pass that along to them. So with that, we will move on.
So I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. I am Paul Zielzorf with the city of Zumbrota. I'm the wastewater operator and supervisor out there. I guess about 3 years ago, me and Steve, both from city of Goodhue, along with Kerry, got talking about some of the upgrades we have done at the Zumbrota wastewater treatment plant. Steve said that their plant they're kind of on the verge of needing a new plant, needing a big upgrade, kind of looking at some options. And we were asked just privately if we would ever be able to handle their flow, if they could get it to us. And after looking at our loadings and the hydraulic issue and stuff like that, we said, yeah, we absolutely could. So then about a year ago, this conversation went a little bit farther as it started creeping up on us. So we said, if we're going to do this, we should be fair and we should include Wanamingo, Mazeppa, and Pine Island, everybody in on this, and see if it's an option to bring all the towns together and have one wastewater plant. That's kind of where we started, I guess. And this whole summer, we've been having meetings over this and looking at a lot of different options, everybody's concerns, how big it would have to be, where it would have to be, all that kind of stuff. And I guess that's kind of where we're at now. That's where this is tonight is kind of the big eye opener of wanting everybody to get on board if we're going to do this, or yeah, I guess that's where we're at.
Good evening. My name is Paul Kimmen. I am the supervisor of the Southeast Southwest Regional Unit with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I'm out of the Marshall office, but my unit does wastewater engineering and permitting and compliance for the southern portion of the state. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what a sanitary district is, some planning considerations, etc. So really, to break it down, a sanitary district is a governmental authority created to resolve a regional pollution problem. We often think of them as for collecting and treating wastewater, which is what we're talking about tonight. That's not the only type of purpose they could be created for, but that is certainly one of them. They can be created 3 separate ways. One is in a process overseen by the Office of Administrative Hearings. And that's a very prescriptive process with a bunch of steps laid out in statute. Another is they can be created by a county board. And again, there's a specific process laid out in Minnesota statute for that. And then lastly, the legislature can create a sanitary district through special legislation. Essentially, once one's created, they're governed by a board of managers, and generally that is 5 managers. If you have more than 5 entities who join the district, you would have more than 5 managers because each entity needs to be represented on the board. So, but generally it's governed by a board of 5. And then once it's created, it's similar to a city in that you have the authority to tax, to bond, to assess fees, to pursue public infrastructure financing programs, and things like that. So can we advance to the next slide? Thank you. So, there's a lot for U.S. cities to consider as you evaluate forming a district. Whether or not a sanitary district is the right solution is obviously up to the local entities that know your situation best. Forming of a district and construction of a central wastewater treatment plant certainly can potentially provide for economies of scale and more efficient use of limited resources. And it can result in lower user costs for the users of the system. You know, that said, it probably goes without saying, but the economics of each situation are different and they should be evaluated on their own merits. And I think, you know, you'll hear more about that from some of your engineers later on. But I'd like to go through just some planning considerations to think about, you know, some things I thought of that if I were in your shoes, I'd want to consider as I'm evaluating this. And, you know, I don't think of these as pros or cons, but just considerations. So, you know, things like how are you going to allocate flow capacity amongst your members? How are you going to handle future growth, whether that be municipal growth or in growth of an existing industry, or maybe a new industry that is within your service area and asks or inquires about connecting to your district. Along a similar line of thought, you know, future expansions. How would you plan and fund future expansions if flows did increase? And also rate structures. Obviously, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to set your rate structures to, you know, fund the system both now and into the future as things may or may not change amongst the communities. And then there's obvious ones like construction cost and operation and maintenance costs, you know, and that would be both of the proposed wastewater treatment facility itself, as well as costs to construct and operate and maintain your lift stations and force mains and all the conveyance infrastructure you're using to get the wastewater to one central location. Another thing to think about would be the board of managers itself and how you would want that set up and who would represent each community. And you know, and speaking of the board of managers, another consideration is simply that if you form a sanitary sewer district, your treatment plant would be overseen by the board of managers, and each community would have representation on the board, but would no longer have direct control over their own treatment facility. So it's just a different model, you know, essentially, and not right or wrong, but something to consider. So I want to talk a little bit about permitting and reporting and kind of give you a feel for how that would change from having your own facility to one regional facility. So from a permitting perspective, let's say some or all of your communities decided to form a district and create a regional treatment facility. We would then issue one permit to that wastewater treatment facility for that discharge. Once your individual wastewater treatment facilities are decommissioned, you could then terminate those individual permits. So collectively, you could have one permit instead of 5, which would obviously result in, you know, less permit fees that you're paying to the state and less reporting, both of DMRs and other reports required by the permit. You know, additionally, collectively, it would result in less sampling, things like that. Now, I do want to point out, if it's a larger wastewater treatment facility, which presumably it would be if you regionalize, you're likely to have a higher frequency of monitoring. You may get additional things like, for instance, wet testing or priority pollutants. And additionally, you may be required to meet more restrictive effluent limits. So for the one permit, the monitoring and reporting may be increased, but presumably collectively you'd have less reporting and less permit fees because you'd have one permit instead of 5. So then to get into permitting a little bit more as far as the process of getting a permit, you know, I think I want to be clear that it's not easy to permit a new discharge. It's certainly something we can work through with you, but there are some additional steps if you're going to permit a new outfall that the city needs to comply with in order to obtain that discharge permit. So, namely, there's something called the anti-degradation review, which, I guess put it kind of generally, the goal of anti-degradation is to avoid negatively impacting our water quality. And you can think of it like if you're going to discharge more pollution or pollution at a new point, you need to justify the need for that and minimize that pollution. So that makes it sound simple. It's a pretty in-depth review and analysis that is required for a new discharge point. Another requirement for the permitting process would be an environmental assessment worksheet, or EAW, which would be mandatory for a new facility designed to treat over 200,000 gallons per day, which yours presumably would be. So I guess just to reiterate, there are some additional steps to go through in permitting a new discharge, and we'd be happy to work through those with the district if that's the route they go. But I want to be clear, it's not easy to permit a new surface water discharge. Lastly, here's a few local examples of some other sanitary districts located in the southeastern part of the state. And I think some who have been working on this, some of the city public works directors, et cetera, and engineers have already spoke to a few of these districts. But I guess my message is I'd encourage the communities to talk to these districts, find out what they like, what they don't. Maybe there's things they would set up differently, try to learn from their experiences. I know the Office of Administrative Hearings has a comprehensive list of statewide districts and their contacts. So that's something that could be requested if you wanted to speak with more of them. But I guess just a plug that I encourage you to reach out to those districts as well and see if they have any input. So that's it for my slides. I don't know if there are any questions now. Otherwise, if not, thank you for your time and attention, and I will pass the baton.
All right. Hi, my name is Craig Britton. I'm a civil engineer with Widseth, and we're the city engineers for Pine Island. So I'll run through some of the advantages that a sanitary district could bring. Like Paul mentioned in the previous slide, a larger facility, such as a regional plant, would gain us an economy of scale. And this leads to the potential of lower costs for treatment of our wastewater. Mainly because this gives us the opportunity to incorporate larger and more robust systems for equipment and controls into the facility. And a larger facility may be better able to handle fluctuations in flows and loading. Our design can incorporate more flexibility in the operation and also incorporate more automation into the facility. In addition to that, the equipment for solid handling is not duplicated amongst many facilities. There's also a potential to gain staff efficiencies and possibly better retention of a wastewater operator. It's getting more and more difficult to find individuals and to hire staff with the qualifications and licenses to operate and maintain our facilities. And a larger facility may be more of a draw for somebody looking to further their career in the wastewater industry. Paul also mentioned the reduction in sampling and testing quantity from one facility. There are all wastewater facilities have minimum monitoring requirements in their permit. And with one facility, the overall sampling and testing quantity will be reduced, thus lowering costs. Paul also talked about permitting, and with that, we would have, with a regional plant, we'd have one single point of discharge into a public water. And this would give us the opportunity to evaluate that discharge point with the MPCA within and throughout the region. And we'd select a site that's most advantageous and that would be able to handle the proposed flows and also give us the least restrictive discharge limits. One wastewater discharge permit to manage and comply with. It's difficult for the individual communities to deal with emerging limits. One example would be phosphorus. Many of us are working under expired permits right now, and the MPCA is working to establish final phosphorus limits before issuing the permits. And this could pose some problems for the individual communities. We'd have to look at financing the improvements to handle these more restrictive limits if they were imposed. Whereas a district's one and only job is to receive and treat that wastewater, so they can better handle those changes. As far as financial pressure, that could be reduced, and that's in the sense of the debt and the bond capacity are associated with the sanitary district and not the individual city. The district would have the opportunity to distribute those costs, not only through user rates, but also through tax allocations spread throughout the communities. And this would help spread the initial capital expenditures. Larger projects such as this facility could potentially put us in good position to secure state bonding dollars as the districts are looked favorably upon by funders. So, Bill?
Thanks, Craig. My name is Bill Angerman. I'm the consultant city engineer for the city of Zumbrota, and I must have drawn the short straw because I get to do the cons tonight. So first item there is for a con is the large initial capital cost. So one of the challenges is that everybody has a sanitary sewer plant right now, and there's a various value associated with that. So when we build a new facility, in essence, if there's a newer part or newer component to that, there's really no salvage value to that. So basically, you're duplicating a process that you may already have. Kind of the kind of going along with that initial capital cost, that last bullet that Craig mentioned, though, there's not funding specifically dedicated to sanitary districts, but it is our belief, people working on this project, that a sanitary district would be more likely to secure state bonding dollars. And that's something that Chris will talk about in a little bit. One note, Paul had mentioned earlier about the other two sanitary districts in Southeast Minnesota. Those were both formed what some of our engineers refer to as the EPA grant days. So back in the 70s and 80s, the EPA generally funded those at a 90% rate. So those days, unfortunately, are gone. So other methods are needed to be found to help lower that capital cost. That kind of goes to that second bullet, loss of an existing asset. Again, if you've done improvements at your plant recently, most likely then that would be abandoned. It's hard to resell or reuse components of a wastewater plant. The third item I think has been mentioned a little bit earlier, both by Craig and by Paul. Potentially stricter discharge limits. An example, as Craig mentioned, with the phosphorus limit, the PCA did submit some draft guidance to the cities here in the last 2 weeks regarding the Zumbro River watershed and Lake Zumbro. An example would be Zumbrota in our next permit round would not receive a phosphorus limit, but most likely, a sanitary district would. Pine Island already has a phosphorus limit, et cetera. So that a larger discharge would be more restrictive. The next bullet there, industrial, commercial, residential allocation controlled by the district, not the city. So in essence, what that means is it's not as flexible. So a city may be willing to, if an industry came into town, how much of their allocation they allocate, or if a large industry came in and there currently wasn't enough allocation, the district will be making that decision, not the city. So that's generally you can work through those issues, but I think it's something everybody has to be aware of. And that kind of really segues into that last one, which is loss of local control. No longer is the city council. You're now a member of an overall board. So it's representation of all the communities versus just the one city. So that was it on the pros and cons. I have the next slide, unless anybody has any questions at this point. Okay, we're going to go into the community background where each of the engineers is going to talk about their city. Being the first one here, I'm going to go over what some of the definitions. So I'm going to go over a little longer version on some of these. So everybody doesn't have to hear that for every single community. So first thing we had is just today's population. And in the case of where you have an industry in town, in Pine Island, Zambroda's case, so we have 3,500 people now. We have 6,700 PE is population equivalent. So that means we're counting Dairy Farmers of America. If they were converted their amount of flow and loading into people, we're the equivalent of, a 6,700 person community. And then what we did is we asked each of the cities to estimate, 20 years from now, which is a typical planning period for a plant, so 2040, how big would your community be then? So in Zambroda's case, it's 4,400, and we did that without Dairy Farmers of America, and I'll talk about that in a little bit down the road. Third bullet, median household income. That's important. Why we included that is for rural development or USDA funding. It is based on one of the criteria is household income. So we wanted to assemble that. The administrators and engineers wanted to assemble that information just to, again, begin some of those discussions on funding, what we think we could be eligible for if we proceeded. Next one, we asked each of the cities to, list out they have any significant industries, because that, oftentimes complicates this, the allocation, et cetera. So in Zambroda's case, it is a little tricky in that we have Dairy Farmers of America, but they are currently, if those of you that have driven by on 52, they're currently doing an expansion and they are seeking their own discharge. So as Paul mentioned, the anti-degradation review, environmental review, DFA is going through that right now. It is unknown if they're going to be able to receive their own discharge into the Zumbro River. So that kind of leaves Zambroda a little bit in a, we're not sure what, if we move forward with the sanitary district, what we would request for Zambroda's allocation. But we do expect over the next 6 to 12 months, that'll become clear. Next item is we then asked each city to just provide a rough estimate of when you would need a plant upgrade. In Zambroda's case, we do not have any new permit limits such as phosphorus or nitrogen that we need to treat. So ours is going to be based more on age of our equipment when that's needed. We're estimating that at about 10 years. Next bullet is NPDS. That stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So that's the name of the permit that we have from the MPCA. The influent, that's oftentimes how you rate plants or you allocate flow and loadings out. So we asked each of the cities to state what their current flows and loadings are. So kind of for the engineers in the room, this makes sense, but I'll just describe real quick. So average wet weather flow. So that is your 30 wettest consecutive days. So think, springtime, your May, June. So in Zambroda's case, that's 1.11 and MGD is million gallons per day. So 1.11 million gallons per day. And then MWW is maximum wet weather flow. In Zambroda's case, that's 1.6 MGD. And then the last two are how we measure the strength of waste. So BOD is biochemical oxygen demand. So that's the strength of the waste. And that's in Zambroda's case, it's 3,800 pounds per day. And then TSS is total suspended solids. And that's, again, 1,875 pounds per day. So again, this is kind of as we start to assemble this and start looking at how big would a facility be, all the engineers are going to take these numbers. And then at the end of each community, we just do have a summary slide here because I'm sure many of you are writing all that down. So I'm just kidding, but we'll have that a summary slide at the end. And then lastly, known issues. We asked each city just to list if they knew they're having any issues. So in Zambroda's case, as I mentioned, DFA is seeking their own discharge. And then I think as Craig mentioned, Zambroda, and I think most of the cities here tonight, our permit, MPDS discharge permit is expired, but it has been submitted. Okay, I'll hand it off to Goodhue.
Good evening. I'm Andy Brandel with ISG, here representing Goodhue as your consulting engineer this evening. Run through the stats here really quickly. Population currently 1260, as you can see, estimated 2040 of 1650. Medium household income about 53,304. Significant industrial users. There really aren't any significant industrial users in the city currently. Plant upgrade needed, replacement within 10 years. I think 10 years there may be a bit of a stretch even. NPDS permit limits. I even though we just got a good understanding of what those are. You can see them here. I'm not going to run through all of them. I mean, as we look at known issues and replacement, Steve both just actually sent me an image of the plant being built in 1934. With this plant being from the 30s, it'll need to be replaced in the not so distant future. It is old, deteriorating, has capacity issues, and upgrades are needed to meet the new NPDES permit that was outlined earlier. Steve does a good job keeping it going, but unfortunately, given the age and other restrictions, it's just a matter of time. That's actually why at the beginning of the slideshow, there's a discussion of Goodhue talking to Zumbrota. That's, you know, largely the reason that conversation got started, is just review of the plant and the current issues that we have with the plant now, and the fact that replacement is going to be required here soon. So any questions? Otherwise, we can keep moving to Mazeppa.
Hi, this is Matt Mose with Bolton and Mink, the engineer in Mazeppa. A lot of the information on, I won't go through the information on the slide here in depth, but the city has recently submitted a draft preliminary engineering report to USDA, which states, I guess, overall is that the plant upgrade needed, we state within 5 years, it's fairly imminent. And that is the known issue here in the city, is that the facility is failing. It's from the 50s, and something needs to be done here in the very near term. Next slide, please.
All right, this is Craig again with Pine Island here. You can see the population is at 3,600 here in 2020. Our significant industrial user is Land O'Lakes. And so the population equivalent in 2040 brings us up to about 5,100 with Land O'Lakes and 4,500 without. The plant upgrade, you know, the plant is getting tired, like many of the community's facilities. So we're looking at needing an upgrade here in the next 5 to 7 years. You can see the stats on the permit limits there. Some of the other issues that we have are, other than the aging facility, are we do have high flows during rain and flood events. So we have some I&I issues that we're working on remedying, and taking care of. But other than that, just a lot of the other issues that the communities are seeing.
Yeah, and this is Brandon Theobald with WH Cass and Company, consulting city engineer for the city of Wanamingo. Very similar to the previous communities. We're seeing some steady growth there. You can see our estimated population equivalent rising for 2040. Very similar situation with replacement. We're planning that within the next 10 years. The current plant's met its useful life. We also experienced, similar to Pine Island, a fair amount of I&I, that rain and groundwater getting into our sanitary system. You can see our actual peak flows there rising up during those rain events. We're currently operating about 25 to 30% of our permitted loading. So moving forward, that'll be something we will be looking at, potentially reducing the permit level and reducing that excess capacity due to the old industry that has been removed from the system. And then we're looking at some flow equalization to ultimately kind of knock down those peak flows, not treat them or not pump them in that instantaneous minute where we have the peak flows, provide some equalization there to reduce the impact of a current plant or a pumping situation. So that's the gist of Wanamingo.
Okay, this is Bill Angerman again from Zumbrota. We just wanted to then summarize the slides here. So just kind of a recap. 2040, so PE is population equivalent. We did not include the industries, you know, Land O'Lakes or Dairy Farmers of America, but we can, you can go back and look at that later. And then reminder, average wet weather flow for each community and max wet weather flow. So we just thought we'd pause here for a second just to give everybody a chance to kind of digest these numbers here, and then we'll move on to funding sources.
All right, if everybody's well digested on that, my name is Chris Swanson. I am a wastewater engineer with Bolton and Mink. We wanted to provide all the community just a little rundown of potential funding sources. As you've heard previously and think about your wastewater infrastructure, this is typically one of the most expensive undertakings most communities do in a single project. And certainly forming a district is also, that just expands and becomes even larger. And so I'm going to go through the first number of bullets here, and then Lance from Minnesota Rural Water is going to touch on the USDA rural development. As with any other good wastewater stuff that Bill's already gone through, we got lots of good acronyms to try to confuse everybody, but I'll try to just run through those. So next slide, please. The first item is what you hear about is a bonding bill, and this comes up every typically even numbered year through the Minnesota legislature, and this is where communities or entities such as a sanitary sewer district can get listed for direct bonding money. This is kind of the most beneficial funding source available. It's the same as a grant from the state of Minnesota. Typically, it's about a 50% local match that's needed, and it needs a good lobbying effort and good legislative support to get listed in the bonding bill. And then, each year we kind of hear about the struggles up in St. Paul as they work to hammer out the size of a bonding bill through the state. And each community is aware of this, and there's a lot of competitiveness as you move towards this. But this is kind of the potential for largest funding of a sanitary sewer district. The next pot of money are a few that are set up and are funded each year. And this is typically called the PFA funding options, or Public Facilities Authority. And the Public Facilities Authority works in conjunction with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and administers three major programs. One is the Clean Water Revolving Fund. This is a low interest loan program, typically about 1.5% loan to fund wastewater and stormwater projects. There's a certain process that's followed on this where you apply, you get ranked, and get listed on the project priority list, and then you send in a letter to the PFA, which acts as the bank, that you're intending to move forward. And so there's a number of forms and stuff that you go through, but that kind of sets you up for the next two as well, which are grant programs, the Water Infrastructure Financing Program and Point Source Implementation Grant. The WIF is an income-based grant program that's funded. It can provide grants up to $5 million for individual communities or sanitary districts based on affordability. And it comes down to that median household income, or MHI, that we went through for each community. The Point Source Implementation Grant is associated with wastewater plants that have specific permit limits in them. The most common one that many communities are hearing about lately is phosphorus, which is a nutrient, or chlorides. And if you get a phosphorus or chloride limit, the improvements can be eligible for this grant. Again, it's a competitive process. They will fund up to $7 million of eligible portions. So if you're most likely one for a district of this nature would be phosphorus. And so the phosphorus portions of improvements that are needed. Again, you have to be on that PPL and IUP. I think the real key to that funding source is as you structure, as you would think about forming a district, it would be kind of critical for each community to get a point source implementation grant, and then the district itself to potentially get a grant. And so that would have to be a well-funded item that year from the Minnesota legislature, because they fund that each year, both through clean water legacy money, but also through that bonding bill. And then each community would kind of need the right limits in order to apply for that, and then the district would need the limits. I think that's probably a potential for the communities, but it does take some work with the MPCA to work through all those permits and limit things for each community, and then also for the district itself. The final kind of things that come through the state of Minnesota are the Department of Employment Economic Development, or DEED. And there's a couple of programs that some communities are able to obtain when they build wastewater infrastructure associated with business development primarily. Both a small cities grant development program, or grant up to $600,000, and then the business development public infrastructure up to $2 million, and that's 50%. Most of the communities that are able to obtain the small cities development grant. The BDPI grant is really associated a lot of times with a specific industry coming to town or doing something that they need. But this is to do with if you build wastewater, it will sustain or build economic development for communities. Those are the main state funding sources. Next slide is Lance will go through and talk about federal funding.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this. You got a very knowledgeable group of people here. I'm very impressed every time. All right, so I'm Lance Lovrink with Minnesota Rural Water Association. I'm a wastewater technician and trainer. I offer technical assistance to wastewater facilities and continuing education opportunities for the licenses that all your wastewater operators hold. So USDA offers a water and wastewater disposal loan and grant program. They provide federal funding for the clean water, clean drinking water systems and sanitary sewer treatment systems, solid waste disposal, and stormwater drainage in rural communities. So the key to this is rural communities under a population of 10,000. That's where they focus their money. They often offer low-term or long-term low-interest loans, and the loans may be combined with a grant to keep the user costs affordable. Funds may be used for treatment, collections, transmission, and disposal of wastewater. Also in land acquisition, permits, equipment, legal fees, engineering fees, initial startup of the plant, and also first year's maintenance. Loan terms may be up to extended out to 40 years. The interest rate is fixed, and that it is based on the need for the project and the median household income for the area served. There's things that move you up if you apply for the grant money and loan money. The project priority list, you can see some of the things that bump you up along the list of more desirable locations to use their money. With everybody, as many of the engineers and cities have talked about some of the new standards and whatnot coming. So we'll move on to the next slide there. All right, the loan and grant median household income. So it's based off the state average of the non-metro median household income, which is currently about 57,000. Grant availability and percentage of project total are calculated from that number. Under about 46,000 is considered the what's termed as the poverty rate, and generally receives about 75% grant and 25% loan. If it's over 61,000 median household income, it's usually just market rate for potential money borrowed with no grant money. In between that 47 and 58,000 roughly is what's called the intermediate rate, and that generally qualifies for 45% grant and 55% loan. All right, we can move on to the next one. So with the median household income, if you were to combine into a sanitary district, USDA calculates that in a different way for your income. So they use what's called a weighted average median household income. So basically you can see from my example there that all the city's populations and current median household income are multiplied out for a total, and then they divide it again by the total population of the whole system to be included. So that can raise and lower your median household income for the group, which may be beneficial and have to be looked at the time of application. So we can move on to the next one. Oh, that was it. So I work with quite a few different sanitary sewer districts and many cities, and I cover the south half of the state. And everybody that I work with the sanitary district is thoroughly impressed with how they operate, and they're very pleased with the results. I just thought I'd throw that plug in there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Lance. I'm just going to give everyone a heads up that we're somewhat starting to wrap up. So if you do have questions, if you could start entering them into the chat feature, and we can address those on the next slide. But first, Brian and I were just going to go through somewhat a loose but aggressive timeline of what we're looking at. So what does this mean? I know there's a lot of information thrown at you this evening, and it's you may be wondering, what are the next steps? What we're looking for is a non-binding resolution of support if your city chooses to do so by March 31st. What this means is, like I said, it's non-binding. We aren't looking for all in. This is give it all or nothing. This is simply saying that, yes, our community is interested. Why is this important? Well, we first started looking at numbers, and it's hard to get an idea of how much this will start to cost when we're using rough estimates of which cities are going to be involved. We figured by bringing everyone together tonight, we can give communities the information they need to make a decision. Yes, we would like to continue to look at a sanitary district, or no, we don't think that this is right for our community. This leaves the cities who are interested a little bit, it gives them a better idea of what the cost may be when we start looking at realistic timelines and costs that will bring to each community. What we're also looking at then is we'll set a planning committee, and we'll need to decide who makes up that committee. How many people from each community, whether it's staff and elected officials, one or the other, or mixed. Also, we'll be preparing a feasibility study, and we'll need to figure out the scope and the fee of that. We're looking to do that in April, since we'll know which communities are interested in proceeding. Then this spring, between April and May, we'll be looking at scheduling meeting with local state senators and representatives. This is critical if you think back to the funding slide of getting monies through different state agencies, as well as getting this project on the state bonding bill.
Am I up?
Sure are, Brian.
All right, thank you. Brian Grudem, I'm the city administrator for Zumbrota. Yeah, as Elizabeth said, the bonding bill, that's going to be a critical portion to our effort. Some good lobbying. To get things to pencil out, we're probably going to need a sizable bond allocation. And also in April-May timeframe, we're going to look to schedule a meeting with the MPCA to talk about limits. As stated, we might run into some stricter limits with a bigger district, and also talk some more about funding. After that, we would look to city councils to authorize a contribution for a feasibility study. We really get into some more in-depth things, and we're going to run into some dollar contribution there to do that effort. And then we'd look to complete the feasibility study and evaluate that in May and June. And then for those communities still interested in being involved, we would look for a resolution of support to proceed July-August timeframe. And then after that, we would look to go into a more in-depth facility plan. And this would really get into the design and a whole lot more dollars. So then we're, at that point, we're all in and we're going after it. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. So with that, we will start jumping into questions. It looks like we'll take questions for about 10 minutes and we'll kind of see where we are after that. If we find ourselves with a lot of questions after that, we might just ask cities to submit them, and as a group, we'll collectively answer them and get them back out to the cities respectively. So the first question is, do we need a set number of cities to create a district? I can answer that, and if anyone wants to follow up, but it's my understanding that no, we could do it if just 2 cities are interested. Obviously, it somewhat depends on what 2 cities, just to make it feasible transporting waste between the cities. But I do know that there are sanitary districts with just 2 cities. Did I do okay, Craig?
Yeah, you did. And Paul responded to that too, and in the chat there too. So said exactly what you did.
Perfect.
You nailed it.
So next question is, what if a city in the district doesn't get a grant or loan? Is there any pre-treatment done by a city before sending it to the central treatment facility? I'm not sure who wants to.
This is Chris Swanson at Bolton Mink. I answered that in the chat and just said typically pre-treatment is not done by other communities. One of the benefits of the district is the economy of scale and having it centralized, so that you try to do all treatment at the centralized location. I'm not sure, Mr. Hahn, you might explain what the connection with grant or loan is and pre-treatment.
Yeah, not connected to pretreatment. Those 2 questions. Maybe I didn't make that clear, but so we have maybe 4 or 5 cities who want to be involved, and each city is individually trying to get these funds and bonds and loans and grants. And is that correct?
Yes, I think there's a certain level of effort that that's done on individual communities to help build what would be pumping stations to get it to a centralized location, and then also a district. It really comes down to what's most beneficial, and so there'd be multiple meetings and strategies on how to make that most beneficial for all the communities.
Okay, so it'd be kind of
the idea of separate entities is double dipping or triple dipping or quadruple dipping on grant funds.
Okay, yeah. So it'd be kind of a cooperative effort, and we'll be working together to try to get the funds we need.
Yes.
Thanks.
So next question, what would be a timeline in years to get a plant built if a sewer district goes forward?
I'll take that. This is Bill Angerman from Zumbrota. So probably the key part of that is the bonding bill. So as Chris had mentioned earlier, that's typically done in even years. So if that's May of 2022, we probably would not proceed on that till after that was known. And once, funding is in place, it's generally 2 years would be pretty aggressive to design and build a plant from that point. So really you'd be looking at 2024 would be fairly aggressive. 2025, you might be more realistic. So, and then if, funding wasn't secured in 2022, then it would have to be evaluated. Well, do we wait again and try again in 2024? Or is that too long for some of the communities to wait?
Any other questions? Okay, I just want, if you haven't seen in the chat, we did have staff from Representative Angie Craig's office on the call tonight, and they're willing to work with us on the federal funding, so that's good to hear. I do have to give a little bit of a shout out to our communications director for running all of the technology tonight. There's a little bit of pressure to make sure that things didn't crash and that the PowerPoint moved forward well. So I do have to give a thank you to Courtney Schaefer.
Courtney.
But any other questions from any of the communities? So I think what the next steps will be is if I'm sure questions will arise. So please utilize your resources. So council members, I encourage you to talk to staff. I'm assuming the staff members from the communities will continue to remain in touch like we have been so that we can coordinate questions, because if one community has a question, I'm guessing another community has that same question. So staff, please keep in touch with each other. Also, just as we move forward, each community needs to decide what's best for their community. So that's why we're giving some generous amount of time, that we aren't asking for the resolution until the end of March. So that gives a little over a month for communities to discuss this and decide what's good for them, and they can proceed in their own manner. And if there aren't any further questions, I think we can go through, and now's the time where you can adjourn your meetings if you are going to adjourn. And presenters, thank you for presenting tonight. And staff members, thank you for all of the hard work you put into this presentation. And with that, we adjourn.